Hey everybody, this is Dream, and tomorrow we have another good college basketball slate for you. This time it's 8 games, the second round of the NCAA tournament. So now we've seen all the teams play the first round, and we got some good games here. We also have some got games a little bit more of a stretch. Overall, though, this slate looks pretty solid. As far as value is concerned, there's some good value plays. There's also some high-end plays. Some players are better priced than others, but lots of secondary plays on this slate. So the way to mix and match in order to get lineups, there's definitely a lot of ways you could go about it today. So with that said, though, before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel. I will do a team breakdown or game breakdown after I get through the top picks here, which are listed. So let's go ahead and get started here. And we're going to start with Kobe Brown, a guard. Now, he can play guard or forward, which is a nice advantage. He's also priced pretty good at $8,500. He's played very well lately. His floor is a little bit lower than some of the other players I have listed, but I have to like him here in this matchup against Princeton, especially if it gets, he should be able to dominate because I don't think Princeton really has anybody that can slow him down. And I like Missouri to actually be able to compete well in this game, and so I think he's a top tier play on the slate. He's just got a great matchup, so that's basically it. And he can play guard or forward, so you can really use him anywhere you want. Then we're going to look at Dejon Harris for Kansas. He seems really priced well here for this matchup. He also gets some assists. Now, the last game he did assist well too against Howard, but the minutes were there, but he didn't really shoot that much, and he doesn't typically shoot a ton, which is a little concerning when he's priced over $7,000. But he has enough upside with the assists and steals that he gets because he does get a lot of steals, and so he is worth taking a look at here. Not a must play, but definitely a good play. And as I get through these guys that aren't must plays, I won't tick them off here. Then we're going to look at JP Pegasus for Furman. Now, if you think Furman has a chance in hell in winning this game against San Diego State, which I actually think they do, San Diego State's not that great of a team. He would definitely be a great option on the slate. He's got a lot of upside, and he's priced pretty low. I do think he's almost a core play. I wouldn't say that he is a core play, but he's very, very close, and so I do think he's viable on the slate. He's probably one of the better plays in general on the slate. Then we're going to look at Jalen Wilson, who's also a core play. He has been pretty good so far this season. I mean, he's priced actually pretty good for what he can do. Though he really doesn't have those gigantic, 50 fantasy point games like we like over, when a guy's over $10,000. But he's at $9,400. Having a 40 fantasy point game or even a 35 fantasy point game wouldn't be the worst thing ever. We should build cash with him regardless. And so I do like him a lot here as he is one of the highest overall players on the slate in general, just from a scoring perspective. And so I really do think he's worth taking a look at and considering in this matchup against Arkansas and Kansas, which should be pretty tough but good. Then we're going to look at Tosan Ivabawam, for Princeton. Now, he is a little bit overpriced. That is a concern here, but if you think Princeton can keep this game close, then he would definitely be somebody to take in consideration, especially since he rebounds and assists really well, and so I do think he has some upside, but he is pretty risky with his price being so high, but again, he is somebody that, if he plays well and Princeton stays close, he will definitely be the guy that is responsible for that happening. Then we're going to look at Charles Bediako for Alabama, and he is my top play on the slate. Bar none, I think he should be the top guy you start with in your lineup. Not only that, but he's also reasonably priced here. And with Brandon Miller up in the air, he would actually get more upside too if Miller ends up being rolled out. The real concern here is the minutes, but I still think he does enough that it makes him worthwhile. He does get some blocks too, which is nice, and he rebounds the ball really well and even scores well for the minutes that he plays. and even though his minutes are inconsistent, he doesn't seem to get hurt too much by it. It keeps his fantasy price pretty limited, pretty low, so that makes him viable here as a forward too. Then we're going to look at Nick Honor from Missouri, and for him, he is streaky. He's been up and down, but he plays a lot of minutes, and he also has the ability to 5x or 6x even at this price. He's had some really big games, and this is a pretty easy opponent for him compared to some of the other opponents, and so I look for him to have a pretty positive potential here. His only bad games recently were against Alabama and LSU, which are both pretty good defensive teams, and also Texas A&M, who's another decent defensive team. I just expect him to have a really solid game, and he doesn't need much in order to pay off for us here. 10 to 15 points would be perfect. And then we're going to look at see here, Micah Parrish for San Diego State. He's a very good value play here who should be able to score and play well against Furman. He really has not had very many sub 10 fantasy point games all season long. The last one was on December 31st, so I don't think he's at too much risk here of having a terrible game. He had a couple, before that point, but he looks like he's been playing pretty well, and he plays a pretty good chunk of minutes as well, so I think he's definitely viable on the slate. But overall, my top three core plays are Pegas, Wilson, and Badiako. So obviously, it's a pretty tough slate, actually, when you look at it, but there's enough value and stuff here that we can make pretty good lineups, I think. With that said, I will do a team breakdown now, and we're going to start with the Furman game here between Furman and San Diego State. Now, this game has a 5-point spread and a total of 137 points. SDSU, obviously the 5 seed, Furman a 13 seed. As for SDSU, they do play a pretty deep bench, more so than anybody else on the slate. And this is a little bit tough because they are projected to score 70 points, but they still looks kind of rough here. Even though Furman is not a good defensive team, this game should be closer than it appears, I suppose. Even because San Diego State's not the best offensive team either. With that said, if we look at this, Bradley, Parrish, and Liddy all have some upside, but they do come with risk. Parrish does seem like he's a decent value play, though. As for Furman, the best bet on this team would be J.P. Pegas. He's played very well, and he seems a little bit underpriced. You could also look at Slauson and as a secondary / Hail Mary play, as he is overpriced, but if you think that Furman can hang with it and potentially win this game, he'd definitely be somebody to consider. They also do play a pretty balanced offense, so as offense, they don't really have one guy that typically goes for a lot, but Marcus Foster also has some low-end secondary value as well. As for Duke and Tennessee, this game has a 3-point spread, so it should be pretty tight, though it does have a low scoring total, which is a little bit disappointing at 127 points. It could be a pretty good defensive game because both teams are pretty good defensively, and both teams tend to be streaky offensively, and so that could be a interesting, way for this game to go. Everyone is overpriced for Duke, though. This team is inconsistent and tends to have, despite the fact that Tennessee has a top defense, Duke is not particularly great in games like this. I don't think. I've seen them play quite a few times, and I usually get disappointed by them. And so I do think it's pretty rough of a matchup for them in general, especially for fantasy, so it just makes it uneasy. As for Tennessee, they're kind of in the same boat with injuries. They're trying to kind of scramble and figure out how they're going to play, and so they do have two big guys that kind of play 20 minutes each, which definitely makes them hard. And then Biscavi is basically their best guy, but it seems like a tough matchup when it comes to the fact that both teams are pretty low scoring for this slate compared to some of the others. When we look at Arkansas and Kansas, now the thing that stands out about this game is only a 3-point spread. Both teams are really good defensively, and they're both decent offensively as well. And so I think that if Arkansas can keep it close, then they're definitely going to pay off a lot some for fantasy-wise. But they are a little bit overpriced, especially if they don't keep it close, which is definitely possible because Kansas can score as good as anybody in the country. But Arkansas has some utility here. They tend to have a bunch of good secondary players, and even a couple guys off the bench look really good. So I don't think anybody on that team is a must play, but they definitely have some utility if you think that game can stay as close as Vegas does, especially it being one of the higher scoring games on the slate. As for Kansas, they do play a pretty short bench, 5 or 6 guys basically, and I think this game will be high scoring. So Wilson definitely has some big time upside here, and then Dejon Harris also does. But they seem pretty good as good plays on this particular slate. Then we have Missouri and Princeton. Now, Missouri is favored to win this game by 7 points. This is also the highest scoring game on the slate, and so that does bode well for Missouri. But the big question here is if Princeton can keep up with Missouri. Kobe Brown and Hodge both have really good upside here. Hodge is more of a secondary play because he's not quite as consistent, but he still has upside. Nick Honor also has some value as a cheap play and worth consideration, even if you think Missouri blows Princeton out. I think he'll play well. Neither one of these teams are particularly good defensively, but Missouri is a good offensive team, so I expect Missouri to be a lot tougher for Princeton than Virginia was. Then we're going to move on to Princeton as a team. This seems pretty tough for them, but if you believe in the miracle of Princeton, then you can load up on Tosin Eva Baldwin, which I can't say his name very well. But if you do like Princeton, then he would be the guy to use. The problem they will have against Missouri is that Missouri is a much better scoring team than their other opponents have been lately, and if they have a chance, then Tosin will be the guy. But I just don't think anyone else on this team is worth even worrying about because of that potential nightmare scenario for them where they get blown out and play more limited minutes. As for the Auburn-Houston game, now this game has a 6-point spread in Houston's favor. Houston is kind of in shock because of injuries. Just got a lot of guys gimpy right now, but it's also a slowdown game. This game doesn't have a very high total, and neither team is projected over 70 points. But both are in the mid 60s, so it does feel risky because they're both good defensive teams as well. And Houston really hasn't played well since Satcher's been hurt. But he will probably play, but it's just somewhat risky. I do feel like the rest of the team is also kind of secondary in nature for Houston, so I think that they're mostly avoidable at this point unless we get some word that Sasser might be out or something like that. As for Auburn, this team is hard to roster if Houston is at full strength, and we'll have to wait and see if Sasser's at 100% or not. And this, I would say that Flanagan would be a good play here, at least close to being one. But he is a little bit overpriced, but he still has some utility on the slate. Though this game is a little bit harder to pull from because everybody's kind of priced above what they probably should be. Then we're going to look at Penn State and Texas. Now this game actually looks fairly interesting as one of the higher scoring games on the slate at 140 total. Even though it does have a 7-point spread in Texas's favor, Texas is somewhat streaky and does carry some risk here. Due to the inconsistent play, that is a kind of a downside, but they do have the ability to score some. And this should be a higher scoring game, and I think Texas will win. But with Timmy Allen coming back, maybe Serge Rice would get some upside here. Would be more limited rather, but he does have some upside, but he's still pretty risky. As for Penn State, there's not really. This team probably has got the most secondary plays of any team. Funk being the favorite here. He's played really well as of late, and I think he has some upside in this matchup. There are many guys on this slate whose ceilings are over. There are not many guys, on this slate that their ceiling is higher than 5x their salary, but but he is one of them, so he is worth taking a look at. And so I think he has some utility here. But it is annoying a game as Texas is projected to win by 7, which is the most on the slate. And then we're going to get into the UCLA Northwestern game. And now this game, while it is on the surface pretty interesting, I do see it potentially getting out of hand in UCLA's favor simply because Northwestern doesn't have a very good offense. One of the weaker offenses on the slate outside of Furman and Princeton, um, which is interesting that they're a 7 seed, but at any rate, for UCLA, if Bono doesn't play, then you would be able to load up on several guys that would be near top tier plays, if not for the fact that they're secondary plays with Bono potentially playing. Um, but it does feel like a nightmare to figure out who to use in a defensive battle here if Bono is out. Look for a few good secondary plays, but other than that, I would probably avoid this team from the rest of the way. Then we're going to look at Northwestern, and Northwestern is the worst offense on the slate, and UCLA is the best defense, one of the best defenses on the slate, and so it's hard to really like anybody on this team. Obviously, you could take a look at the scoreboards and see who's scoring the most points for them, and potentially utilize that guy. Then we're going to look at Bama and UMD, Maryland. So this should be a high-scoring game for Alabama. And even though Miller is a game-time decision, look for other guys to step up, including Betty Rico, who's been playing extremely well lately, and he is a borderline top play on the slate, so I think he's definitely somebody to consider. And then finally for Maryland, I really wanted to like this team, but they are overpriced. Carey and Young have some secondary value, but you still feel risky using them, and Bama is a high-scoring, defensive intense team. So with that said, guys, that's what I have for the slate. I don't think it's a terrible slate, but I don't think it's a great one either. But there's lots of different ways you can build these lineups, so get at it. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And otherwise, have a nice day, guys.